right, good morning. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for beginning Brooklyn Book Festival with us this morning. I'm Emily Nemmons, the editor of the Parish Review, and I am delighted to be moderating this conversation between three tremendous writers, Maxim Osipov, Ishan Hutchinson, and Jean-Baptiste Del Amo. As you may have guessed by the name, the Parish Review has its own international lineage, and even as we've hung our shingle in New York since the mid-'70s, advancing the exchange between literary traditions around the globe is in our DNA. Along with assembling anthologies of interviews with international writers, such as this new one, Writers at Work Around the World, we do what we can in our print quarterly and on the Parish Review daily to celebrate that discourse and steer the conversation in exciting new directions. That's a long way of saying it's an honor to be here. To give you a sense of our 50 minutes together, I'll introduce these three gentlemen. We'll hear just a bit about their work before moving into conversation. Immediately after our program, the authors will be signing their books right outside in the rotunda, and if you need to get their books, those are available for purchase right outside the building. You can get one, come back. They'll be around for half an hour. And I'd also ask audiences silence your cell phones, and when we're done, let's all go out into the rotunda to keep the conversation going. There's another program here at 11. All right, Maxim Osipov is a Russian author and cardiologist since 2007. He has published 5 collections of prose, and his plays have been staged across Russia. To quote Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich, his prose now reads like something of a diagnosis, an accurate, unforgiving diagnosis of Russian life. His most recent story collection, Rock, Paper, Scissors, and Other Stories, is his first to appear in English. On behalf of English readers everywhere, I want to thank New York Review of Books and the 3 translators, 2 of whom are here today, for their efforts. We're fortunate to have Boris, one of those 3 translators, reading just a passage from Maxim's work. Maxim lives in Tarusa, which is 101 kilometers outside of Moscow. We'll get back to the 101 in a minute. Ishan Hutchinson was born in Port Antonio, Jamaica. He's the author of 2 poetry collections, Far District and House of Lords and Common. As Dan Chasen aptly characterized it, Ishan's verse is punk baroque, a brilliant protest of abstract authority. His powerful poetry has received many accolades, and rightly so. I shorten the list, but it includes the National Book Critics Circle, the Guggenheim Foundation, and recently the Wyndham Campbell Foundation. He is a semi-regular contributor to the Parish Review, and thank you for that. I'm glad to finally meet today, and a contributing editor to the literary journals The Common and Tongue, a journal of writing and art. Ishan's traveled the shortest distance to join us here today. He teaches at Cornell. And lastly, Jean-Baptiste Del Amo is one of France's most exciting and ambitious young writers. He is the author of 4 novels, Pornographia, Le Sel, and Une Education Libertine, which won the Goncourt First Novel Prize. Animalia, his 4th novel, is his first to appear in English, and we're grateful for the translator Frank Wynn's efforts. Jean-Baptiste's writing in Animalia has garnered comparisons to Zola's naturalism and Faulkner's lyricism. No pressure there, but the comparison is apt. The book just arrived in the US last week, published by Grove, and has already garnered rave reviews. Said one reviewer, the florid prose has an incantatory power well suited to the festering inhumanity and majestic squalor on display. This uncompromising vision will leave readers breathless, thrilled, and exhausted. So those are our 3 writers. Boris, would you like to start by reading a bit of Maxim's?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very honored to read this, especially because it isn't my translation. Normally, I prefer to read my own. But in this case, I'm reading a gorgeous translation by Alex Fleming, and one of the first stories that we worked on together for this collection that serves as the preface to the collection. It's called The Cry of the Domestic Fowl. And it's an abridged version, and I may abridge it even further as I move. Pardon. The provinces is home, warm, grubby, ours. But there's another way of looking at them, an external, superficial point of view, yes, but one shared by many who didn't choose to end up here. The provinces is sludge, the doldrums. That the locals are pitiful is the most flattering thing one can say about them. The cry of the domestic fowl drives out the dark thoughts that take hold through the night. Morning at the hospital. On the bed lies a skinny, smoked-out man, a bus driver who's had a heart attack, a bird of the wild. For him, the worst has passed, so he watches the medics treat the patient next to him, a trampish-looking old man whose wrist bears the blue sun tattoo of a prison camp guard. An electric shock, his heart rhythm returns to normal. Old fella's still ticking. The driver chuckles from behind the screen. He and I exchange glances. Will they let him drive his bus again? And the more burning issue. What if his wife runs into the other woman, the one who brings him shashlik at his bedside? But this driver could also tell you a thing or two about me. These wild birds are very perceptive. We're compelled, clearly, not only to love those we are close to, our fellow domestic birds, but our wider surroundings too, the people and the place. And to do this, one must notice, recall, invent. And so, from my childhood, my father and I are walking somewhere. It's far away. The day is hot. We're out in the countryside, and I'm desperate for a drink. My father knocks at a stranger's house, asks for some water. The woman says there is none, but she brings us some cold milk. We drink and we drink a lot, probably 3 pints. My father offers her some money, but she just shrugs and asks, straight-faced, "You out of your mind, dear?" Another memory. I'm 18, driving an old Zaporozhets, when suddenly in the back, where the engine is, I see a cloud of smoke. I'm expecting the worst, an explosion. There are people on the pavement. Get back, it's going to blow. Pop it open, says a man about 30, walking by. He takes out a rag and, calmly, unhurried, smothers the flames. Then he walks off, another bird of the wild. Of cars, of travel more generally, the memories come thick and fast. Domestic creatures are prone to trouble on the roads. This is where they cross paths with wild and predatory birds. Such encounters make their mark through unexpected goodness, through evils previously unimagined. Killers, they're just your average people, the police chief will say. And then all of a sudden, you chicklet, you domestic little thing, you'll accept it, you'll get it. It'll become part of you. While on the subject of the police, the doctors here enjoy their own special relationship with the force. Whether it's getting a patient up the stairs when the elevator's broken down, locking up the drunks till morning so they don't brawl in the wards, or even towing an ambulance out of the mud, they have the police on speed dial. They too wear a uniform and give the local populace the illusion of security. What else? A sermon once heard on the intercession of the Theotokos. The day on which our pagan forefathers were defeated is now one of our most respected holy days. There's no easier pastime than bad-mouthing the church, much like bad-mouthing Dostoevsky. It's true, of course, all true, but it also misses the point. The church is a thing of wonder. Dostoevsky is a thing of wonder. And the fact that we Russians are still here, that too is a thing of wonder. Around here, the private comes before the public. A tax official, a 20-something kid, does our auditing. "Oh," he'll say, "a good thing you're a doctor. As it happens, the Army have, I'm trying, you know." It's not hard to catch his drift. "On compassionate grounds" is a very reliable turn of phrase. We're all in one another's hands. But where Moscow doesn't believe in tears, as they say, around here, tears are the only things we do believe in. When the need is great, we make an exception. It's ugly. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be touched by it, but this happy-go-lucky collective deceit unites the nation as well as any good law. Electricity, gas, phone bills unpaid. In the capital, a lack of money is something to be ashamed of. Here, it's pretty much the norm. The utility company employees try to help us out here and there. These meter readings look way off. Why don't I reset a few values? Thank you, that's just what I thought. And if you or your family ever need a doctor, uncles, granddaughters, nieces, water, electricity, gas, it's familiar, comfortable, benign. And though it may have its drawbacks, as a way of life, it's pretty stable. Here, nobody has any secrets, just like in heaven. By evening, it becomes clear that far too much time and energy have gone into one of the day's tasks, while many are left undone. Twilight sees the return of cruel, exasperated thoughts, specifically, where did all the bright people go? When we were young, there were enough of them around. What, did they all emigrate? One thought latches onto another. It's a vicious cycle. Night and its fears make the spirit more vulnerable to evil. To make matters worse, swallows and tits often fly into the house, a very bad omen. But there's nothing you can do. You can't live your life with your windows closed. Either move if you're afraid, or let go of these superstitions. Such are the thoughts that churn in the mind until dawn arrives with its brief respite of sleep. Life is scary, whether you're in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or the provinces. We can say as much. It is scary. There are things in life of which it is impossible to write. The deaths of innocents, young people, children. The terrifying, unnecessary experience of their deaths stays with us. That can't be cried away. No cry can drive it out. But then day will come, and the birds will still be there. Fowls of the air, fowls domestic, wild, all of them. The world doesn't break, no matter what you throw at it. That's just how it's built. Thank you.
Thank you. Question?
Want me to go?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning. I will read a section from a poem called Far District. And it's an opening of a long sequence, and it's subtitled Outer Eden. When nothing existed in the district, and I walked around with knapsack and notebook like Adam in the garden, naming things. A derelict at Halfway Tree Square told me the sea is our genesis and the horizon exodus. I wanted to recant, there is nothing here, no visible history. My tongue stoned, dried-brained, I boarded the sardine can bus to school. Packed in that heat, a memory sparked and died in the murmur of tired bodies. I limboed between the aqueducts and pui trees on campus before history, the histrionic ghost staring at the blackboard, at centuries chalked in white like the professor's hair, his liver-spotted hand holding the ruler, stabbing timelines, then stopping at 1492. Before that date, nothing. A less barbaric term, a civil one in light of the topic, is an era of darkness. A few primal inventions, tools fashioned from bones and stones, but no real industry there until sugar. He meant that shithole east of Portland, Outer Eden. Back there, calendar was useless. I knew days by studying the cane cutters. Monday, a trickle. Tuesday, a drove. Wednesday and Thursday, a river swell that on payday Friday flooded the town square. Sunday mornings I knew by two happenings. First, the lashing of Crecker's albino woman by Crecker before the first cock crowed. And then before church time, that perennial hog Hyacinth shuffling yard to yard hawking her dry goods. Today, Friday, if I leave this lecture and go back, the talks wouldn't be Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Not those nothings, but how nothing happens. And I would hiss my teeth. Stasis in any name is stasis. That benign parish is the heart's dark interior, the island's bushed-in mindset, a place forgotten by the cartographer, but buried inside me to decompose. Here I am, planted in this desk of a nascent history, and it dawned that the mad hermeneutic Rasta was wrong. My beginning was not the sea. My departure was not the horizon. I am nothing. I am dirt where no light can reach. There, this monody I unearthed.
And thank you. That was beautiful. I'll read just a bit of the opening of the second section of Jean-Baptiste's novel. The earth begins to murmur, the sap to well in the trees, rising slowly through the trunks, and buds swell beneath the bark along bare branches. Opalescent larvae writhe beneath the layers of humus and in the rotting stumps, woken from their torpor by the thaw, and brown pupae begin to hatch. In the village cemetery at first light, the grass snakes slither from a vault and rest on a gravestone half hidden by ferns. The ice from the reservoir, which more reckless village children cross in the dead of winter, has long since melted, and water striders ripple the surface of the water as they scurry. In spring, the women of Puy-la-Roque and the surrounding farms gathered at dawn around the village wash house. They come on foot, on carts, on mules, with a barrow, or carrying large burlap sacks filled with the linens they watch only once a year, as though starched with sweat, mud, and the secretions of men and of those of animals. All winter, they have collected the ashes from the hearth and protected it from inclement weather in these same burlap sacks. The washing is laid out on the cool, dew-damp grass in the morning sun and the smell of hay. The washerwoman sets out buckets of water drawn from the wash trough, and in them dissolve flakes of lye soap, which gradually scents the air. At the hour when the cocks are crowing and the calling to one another, the men are sharpening scythes and setting off, donning their caps beneath the blue sky in which a sliver of moon and a handful of stars still gleam, scythe handles resting on their shoulders, a few dogs trotting at their heels. Since the father's death, Alphonse will only go with Marcel, but he no longer runs ahead of him or Eleanor, nor bounds across ditches. He simply walks alongside, head hanging low, and lies down as soon as possible to rest his hind legs, which have grown stiff. His eyes are covered with a bluish pall, and his coat has turned white. The washerwoman plunges the laundry into soapy water, where it disgorges swirls of blackish fluid. In the quiet farms, the chickens grow bolder and venture into the houses whose doors stand open to let in a little cool morning air. They peck under the tables, perch on the back of chairs, hop up on the beds, where sometimes they lay an egg, which they sit on until they are chased off with a broom. Sitting on the grass in the shade of fig trees heavy with sap, the washerwomen talk. Sometimes one of them will get up to stir the laundry, which is left to soak all day. The blades of the skies blaze in midday sun, and white flashes course through the meadows. Wearing scarves and armed with washboards, the women trample the grass, which gives off a sweet perfume. The youngest children are sitting or lying at the foot of the trees, watching over their sisters from time to time. A young mother lies down, unbuttons her blouse to reveal a swollen breast, and suckles a newborn. The air smells of the women's perspiration, of trampled grass and sweltering cattle. From field to meadow, the farmers call to one another in jubilant voices. The haymaking is good this year, and will carry on into July for the late fields. They will have enough to feed the animals and face the harsh winter. So I thought maybe a good place to start our conversation would be with the title, which I did not pick, the Village People, and this question of rurality or village communities, whether or not that actually fits all of your writings. I know I mentioned the 101 kilometers. Maxim, maybe we can start there.
Well, yes, the concept of 101, kilometer 101, came from the fact that during Stalin time, not only Stalin time, even before that and after that, during Soviet Union time, people after having been sentenced for prison and for concentration camp, they were not allowed to stay in big cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Tbilisi, etc. So they were sent to kilometer 101 zone. And Tarusa was lucky to have many intellectuals. Among them was my grandfather, who was also a physician. So this is how this concept started. And I just remembered the friend oncologist from NIH, from Washington, D.C., whom I sent the first essay about Tarusa. She did not realize, she didn't know the name Tarusa, so she sent me an email saying, Is Tarusa, what is it? Is it state of mind? So I would say yes, it is state of mind. And in order to describe what I love actually in this state of mind, I wrote this first essay that was beautifully translated by Alex and beautifully read by Boris right now. So this is what I can say about this briefly.
And you had lived in Moscow and then moved to Tarusa full time. Can you speak sort of about how reconnecting or connecting for the first time with that smaller community maybe soaked into your...
Yeah, well, it happened gradually, yes.
Yeah.
But these days I really dislike Moscow very much, and I like Tarusa, so I try to spend as much time as I can, because Moscow is a very tense place, and you don't really understand what is this tension for, for a group of people to steal gas and oil, and that's it, all this traffics and all this, And Tarusa is different, so, and it, to say briefly what I love there, it's in this essay, it's understanding. I would say I have understanding that I do not have in Moscow. I wouldn't have it if I immigrate. So that's how it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Jean-Baptiste, do you want to talk? The farm rendered in Animalia is, the novel starts in 1898 and goes until 1981, which is the year of your birth, yeah?
Yeah.
And so I guess there's two renderings of both farm life, but also the historical stretch of imagining what this same landscape looked like a century ago. Can you speak a little?
Well, I was born in the south of France, and I grew up in this countryside that I describe in this book. And when I started writing Animalia, I wanted to use my memories of those landscapes and the feelings and sensation I had as a child when I was walking around in this countryside. So I started by writing the third part of the book, which takes place in the modern time. And then I went back by drawing a genealogic tree for my characters, and I went back to the end of the 19th century. And I tried to show how the landscapes has moved during the time upon a century, and how my characters are also going to change, and how their relationship with the nature all around is going to change also.
When you were writing that first part, which is the third section set in 81, and remembering your childhood, was the brutality, was that the central kernel, or did that sort of evolve? There's such a social commentary around what's happened to the countryside in your book.
Maybe the relationship of those characters with their environment has changed because they probably lost a kind of connection with the nature all around, and that's what my characters are fighting with. In the same, when the farm is going more and more intensive, they are losing their connection with the nature all around and with the animals they are breeding. And I also wanted to show that they had in the past, I don't have a kind of nostalgia of the old farm, the old traditional farm, and the old traditional way of life, because it was a very rough life. And but they had some kind of, I don't know, poetry in this very charnel, relationship with nature.
Great, thank you. Ishan, do you want to speak to the landscape? I think of Jamaica, and so much of the imagery in your poetry does carry on, but of course you're writing from New York, so it's a different variant as well.
Yeah, it's on it. Yeah, am I writing from New York? I wonder because
Are you? I don't know.
I feel that once you've grown up in a landscape, you have become that landscape, and you're writing from there simultaneously in memory and in the present. So, though one is removed from the landscape because I am here in this country and in this state, for instance, nonetheless, because I am still working out the relationship to self and place, I sense strongly that I'm writing there, right? The landscape of Jamaica is extraordinarily beautiful. It has, as you know, because it's such a strong tourist place, beaches and that kind of stuff, and mountains, the Blue Mountains, ranging in the middle of the island, and so on. So there's this natural beauty that strikes the eyes. But beneath it, or at the same time, the horror of history plays alongside the naturalism, which might not strike the eyes if one arrives as a visitor. And I think every Jamaican understands the trauma of history, and even though one lives within the beauty of the landscape, is trying to resolve what it means to be positioned in a place that has this wonderful culture and energy, but is built on the bloods of a terrible history. And when I write, I'm trying to somehow inhabit both spaces at once, the beauty and the terror.
Thank you. I can see that. I know with Maxim and Jean-Baptiste, both of those books are very much in a small community. I feel like, especially with your most recent book, House of Lords and Commons, it's situated many places, including Jamaica, but if anything, you're writing back and referencing back to its colonial history. Has that continued to be?
Yeah. I don't think it's going to go anywhere soon. The unraveling of the colonial burden, you know, time doesn't really, time does create distance between the horror of the history itself. You find hardly any sugar factories around. There are some that still sort of function in the similar way it did in the 19th century. But because we have inherited so much there that from that history that still informs the present time. And I feel a writer's duty is to confront that narrative, right? And it can be done in very subtle ways, of course. Writing a poem that is in the voice of a character from wherever in the country is a form of confrontation in itself. It might not be political or dealing with any of the traumatic issues, but simply by owning the voice in the most authentic way possible is resisting that history. The Jamaican music, of course, is the great force of that form of resistance. The love songs that come from reggae music are protest songs to an extent. They want to own the beauty of the black body that has been maligned throughout history. For instance, celebrating the way in which someone just simply go about an ordinary day is a powerful way to remind people of their strength and not necessarily that strength is always contested politically, right? But it's just a way of being.
You spoke of musicality, and while we were in the green room, we were talking about the challenges of translating poetry. I think this might be, let's take a few minutes to talk about work in translation. This, Jean-Baptiste and Maxim, these are your first books to appear in English. Can you speak a little bit about your arrival into English, how it feels to be hearing your work in this new language, the process of assembling your collection, for instance?
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to have, my works have been translated into many languages, but this is my first English book, and since English is the only foreign language I know somehow, and since it is so big, I'm very, very happy and very proud. And also, my translators can confirm that I try to do what I can to facilitate translation. I put a lot of notes to every story I write, like at the end of the work, always, it could be like 200 notes for 8 pages long story. So really to explain all sources of citation, difficult words, new words, some realities that translators might not be aware of. And I always, I like when translators go away from what I wrote, not to make it exact, because this way it would be a loss. You cannot make exact translations. So, for example, a simple example is that one of my stories, the last story in this collection, its name is Fantasia, which is both fantasy in Russia and imagination. So fantasy is a musical form, Fantasia. Initially, Boris suggested to translate it as imagination, but this is, I thought, we could find more interesting title. So now it's called Objects and Mirror, which also fits better, but I think Objects and Mirror is better title than imagination, right? So, things like that. I don't have much time to really discuss all these issues, but I was very lucky, really, with translators, and I'm very grateful to them and to publisher. So, yes, it is pure happiness. That what I feel now.
Great, thank you.
The most important for me in translation is to be sure that the translator understands my desire about the story and also about the language, my intentions. And of course, because of course a book, when it's translated, it becomes something else, and I like this idea, and I always think that the translations are probably better than the originals because they pay so much attention to details. Most of the time they have to look for many words and try to find the most the one who fits the best, with your first intention. So. I always say to my translators, of course, if you have questions, tell me, but you also have to feel free to take my language to yours and to create your own universe and your own book.
Were there any passages or decisions made in Animalia that surprised you in that way?
No, I think Frank Wine did a very, very good job, and I know it was quite difficult because sometimes it's very specific language, especially about nature.
Right.
And
there's
so
a lot of animal husbandry.
Yeah, he told me he has to make a lot of research But I was very impressed by his work, and I think I can feel, well, it's not that easy for me to read the book in English, and that kind of English, because it's quite difficult. But I was very impressed by his work, and I think he created something else, but that is very respectful to my first intentions.
Great. Ishan, I think the other side of it, writing from English into translation, and of course with poetry, there's more of the lyric, the metrical, the musicality to consider than perhaps a 400-page novel. Can you speak a bit to your experience?
Yeah, I find similarly I had to provide notes sometimes for certain poems, usually to clarify local references, things that are vernacular speech, or things that just images that are very specific to the Jamaican landscape. But as someone who reads a lot of translation, and know many poets who translate, and I'm always engaged in this discussion whether or not the music of the original language can make its way into the language the poem is being translated. And it seems that this is the greatest difficulty. And you can't have that music precisely in the new language, of course. So then the question is, what is the approximated music that enters into the translated language? And I've been fortunate to hear my poems read in different languages, and do feel a kinship to the sounds, right? And that must have been an extraordinary task for the translator. But yeah, there's still a question there for me. It's not about precisely the what I would say, the exactness of the music, the cadence and so on, but the sense of poetic elevation, does that still remain, or is the language flattened out in the translated version? So, and that I cannot answer because I don't know the other languages.
All right, thank you. I do want to save just a few minutes for questions, but I want to speak about the original form for just a second. Maxim, I am a devout fan of the long short story, and I think you've really mastered that form in your collection. I'm wondering how does a story, an original, how does it come together? Do you see they're often fairly complicated structures, either nested narratives or some modulation of voice between characters? Is that intuitive? Is that through revision? How do you arrive at these fairly complex structures for your stories?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's the most difficult part to explain, really, because something should be primary, you know. And for me, it's composition. Composition comes before, and I don't really think much about composition. It's just happens. So it's really hard to explain, seriously. But the sources of, you know, short stories or long short stories, it's very special thing, I think. It's like people think it's closer to novels, but in fact it's closer to poetry in my, from my point of view. In terms of, like Auden said, the poetry makes nothing happen. So from short stories, you cannot really learn much. You can learn something about, you know, whatever, Civil War from big novel, but you can learn almost nothing from the short story, like from a poem. It delivers messages. Of course, message is essential thing. You know, but it delivers it like music sonatas. It's not. It's another form of message. So, you know, that's. I know I'm not very very helpful. But
You can
that-
keep it shrouded in mystery. That's fine.
yeah. Yeah, but for me, main sources, sources of, I would say, of inspiration, it's more, first of all, it's medical texts, which you will be surprised, which I was a publisher for a long, long time, and I tried, and a translator of medical textbooks into Russian. So I always tried to, find an essence to deliver the message as short as possible, to omit unnecessary words, etc. So I think it affected my style a lot. Also Russian poetry and music, which music really plays a big role in my life. Classical music, obviously. So.
Do you have a favorite composer? A favorite composer?
Oh, that's impossible to name it. If you say 20 favorite composers, I would probably be easier with that. Yeah, well, so that's what I think.
Thank you. Jean-Baptiste, we talked a little bit about the larger structure of the four sections, but can you speak a bit about how you arrived at the line and a very lyrical?
Well, this book could have been a very classical historical novel, and I didn't want that. I wanted to write a very contemporary novel. So I tried to, how can I say, to distort, can I tell you that? To distort the structure, and try to play with the time and the images, and that's how I ended with this kind of diptych, in two big times, at the end of the 19th century and the year 1981. And I thought it could be very interesting to have a confrontation between those times and let the reader free to imagine what could have happened in between.
Great. Ishan, do you want to talk about form in relation to your poetry? That's a big question, I know.
And I'm so aware that we're running out of time to take up form. Only to say, for me, it happens along the line, right? There's an internal rhythm that mingles and takes shape when I sense a poem coming on, but that only goes. It doesn't. That's not the poem that will eventually be made.
Yeah.
The rhythm suggests what the poem might be, and I try to track what it is. And the way to sustain the poem is to turn to different forms, which then I discover. I think I discovered what form a poem might take on along the way of writing. But I am desperately trying to remain somewhat faithful as possible to the original rhythm, the rhythm that dictated the poem in the first place. But sometimes it can start with an image. But I feel for me that the rhythm is the primary driving force, and that's the challenge to hone in order to make a poem happen. Every time I hear the Auden quote, poetry makes nothing happen, I am always hopeful that the second part of that line is also evoked, because Auden then goes on to say it lives in the mouth as a way of happening, right? So it's a typical thing that the poet tends to contradict the self. So poetry makes nothing happen as a statement, right? As an agenda, but as an expressive force, as something that changes the language and even the actual mouth of the speaker. Then there is a true transformation that is the crown and glory of poetic action.
Thank you. I think that's a really great place to wrap it up. If there are any burning questions, we have time for maybe one or two. The writers will be outside in the rotunda signing books, and I'm sure can continue the conversation as well. Parish Review will be at booth 307 for the day, so I'm happy to talk to anyone there. Any questions for the panel before we wrap it up? See one hand. To repeat the question for these guys, she was wondering about the politics of the provincial, which is something we started to talk about, but we should certainly circle back. In Tarusa, it's something of a respite from Moscow, but it's very problematic in other cases. I'd say in your novel, if you guys would like to address that briefly.
Well, briefly, the politics is in Russia these days. It's terrible, and one cannot avoid it in Moscow, either in Moscow or in Tarusa or elsewhere. And those who say that they do not notice it, it's like, or they are not interested. For me, it's always like to say, I am not interested in oncology when you have, cancer, the fourth stage. I mean, you can, or I am not interested in obstetrics when your wife is going to deliver a baby. It's just ridiculous. So even, and of course, politics affects a lot my writings, even if I do not mention directly, Putin or other people. For Russian reader at least. It is there, and it is a lot of it there. So, since I started to quote English writers, I will give you another quote. I will give both quotes that I know from this language. Actually, it's "Humankind cannot bear too much reality," said Eliot. So in Tarusa, it's easier to bear this reality, but still it is there. You can do nothing about it. Yeah. So this is briefly.
Thank you.
Briefly too, I am weary of a kind of too strong a distinction between rural and urban and so on. I don't think they really help, because rural tends to fall into a kind of second-rate and provincial category, and the urban supposedly is sophisticated and so on. Well, Jamaica is primarily what we would call a rural country. We have really only one city, one bona fide city in the kind of metropolitan definition of it. But people from all parts of Jamaica have to pass through that area. And so there's a kind of flow, a fluidity between the city and country. Of course, there are different anxieties. For instance, growing up in a small part of Jamaica, we don't use the word village, we would say district. Growing up in a district, the ways in which privacy works is quite different from in a city. So in a country, in the countryside, one might feel an openness because of the landscape, but within the private lives of people, I feel that there is less a sense of having a privacy that the way you feel it in the city space, right? You can't just, everybody knows you in the country. You can't hide. Windows are left open. Everybody talks about each other, but also in a kind of whispered way too, right? So to turn to poetics just very slightly, because when one comes from one of these districts and entering into the city space, I take with me the whispered, buried tones into the city, and I feel that informs the kind of poetic line I'm interested in. The things that is said under the voice, right? Under that, even not necessarily in the language itself, but within the spaces between the words, right? Something where the truth lies, some sort of revelation that the words themselves can't really bear, but the tone or something within the musicality of the language reveals. So that's a really rough answer to your question. Thank you for it.
All right, I think that's it. That's all, folks. Thank you again for starting your day with us.
Thank you.